Brown a round of applause. Now we'd like to have Dr. Julian Vasquez Heilig. Give him a round of applause.
Thank you. I'm so honored today to stand shoulder to shoulder with students, parents, community activists at this briefing. I'd also like to invite you to tweet at me, at Professor JVH, and I'll also reblog my comments tomorrow at Cloaking Inequity, and I just shout out to Denisha, she's been tweeting at me while I've been sitting up here. So, massive school choice is a relatively new educational policy approach. In May 2013, the Chicago School Board voted to close 47 elementary schools. At the time, it was the largest number of schools closed in 1 year by any district in the nation. School closure has become a highly contentious issue, as you heard today. School boards, often politically appointed like they are in Chicago and sometimes elected in other places, have recently focused on a variety of top-down policies such as school closure. We have even come to the point where discussions have occurred that would essentially close entire districts and turn them into top-down private control zones, similar to what you see in New Orleans. Dallas and more recently Los Angeles in California have considered this option. Proponents of school closure argue that students should receive relief from low-performing schools. Nobody's denying that these communities have been underserved and under-resourced, and as Jutu Brown once said, sabotaged. But it's still an open question whether school closure does what proponents purport it does. So I'd like to walk you through some of the more prominent research and data on school closure. I will discuss research from some of the well-known closure locales, New Orleans, Chicago, New York, Michigan. I will also briefly talk about some of the lesser discussed school closures in Ohio and North Carolina. I'll begin with the minority of research that purports that there are some benefits of school closure. A Journal of Public Economics study focusing only on test scores in Michigan found that achievement of displaced students improved if the closed school was low performing. However, the study also found that students in receiving schools suffered academically due to the large influx of students. A Fordham Foundation studying Ohio school closures found that test scores marginally increased for students after their school closed. However, the National Education Policy Center's review of that same study noted that 40% of the students that transferred out of Ohio schools transferred into other schools that were not high performing. NEPC noted that the Fordham study did not separately report or apparently control for the academic and performance of students who remained in low-performing schools. And then a study that you probably recently saw in November out of New York by the New York Research Alliance found that closures had little impact on the academic outcomes of students who attended closed schools. Achievement didn't go up, achievement didn't go down. However, they still proffered that school closure improved graduation rates for students who would have theoretically attended those schools. Clearly, there are too many factors to consider that would explain an increase in graduation rates for students who never even attended the closed schools. Now for the bad news. Research out of North Carolina showed that school closure impacts students negatively during the closure year. A study conducted by the State Board of Education in North Carolina found that students displaced by closure experienced negative effects in the announcement year. Additionally, while 76% of students technically went to schools that were higher performing, only 14% of students transitioned to schools with composites above 60% passing. New Orleans and Chicago are probably the most infamous locales where school closure has occurred en masse. First, I'll discuss Chicago. The problematic outcomes of school closures are readily apparent in the data from Chicago, and Jutu has talked about this. And this negative data has been fairly consistently bad news over time. For example, CREATE, which is the Chicagoland Researchers and Advocates for Transformative Education, found that school closures have historically had a negative impact on students' performance. Analysis of school closures in Chicago revealed that 94% of students from closed CPS schools did not go on to academically strong new schools. School closures have not resulted in the savings predicted by school officials, Rahm Emanuel et al. Closure-related costs have consistently been underestimated and understated. School closures have exacerbated inequalities and segregation in Chicago. Approximately 90% of the school closings have predominantly impacted African American communities, according to Create's data. Then there's Louisiana, the locale where top-down education reformers pressed for widespread school closures after Katrina. Have school closures spurred an education miracle in Katrina 10 years after the storm, like they would have you believe? In a recent policy brief that I authored and that was released by the Network for Public Education, I collected public data from state and federal sources. These data show that Louisiana and RSD are last and nearly last in every single educational outcome. More than 10 years after the school closure and school choice arrived in New Orleans, the results from top-down reform are dismal. Mercedes Schneider, a Louisiana teacher and blogger, reported that in the summer of 2013, parents were required to, quote, choose from almost all DNF schools when they completed the Walton Foundation's funded one-app enrollment form. And this is an idea that's being spread across the nation, a one-app enrollment. The RSD had no A schools and only a few B schools back in 2012 and 2013. Currently, the RSD still has no A schools, only a handful of B schools. While the Orleans Parish has mostly A and B schools, some charter, some not, the OSP-SB is quite small when compared to the RSD. Also, many of its schools use selective admissions processes. And some of the preferable schools often had additional application criteria beyond the one app as a way of pre-screening applicants. So essentially, the New Orleans school closure model has created a market tiering of schools, like wine or ice cream aisle in a grocery store, where you can afford or get access to certain wines, but maybe not others because you may not have the capital to access or purchase those products. In the case of New Orleans, capital for families and students is transportation, test scores, and other admissions requirements. Essentially, school closure has created market segmentation in New Orleans, where only certain students with various forms of capital can gain access to high-quality schools. New Orleans parents, such as Karen Harper Royal, have discussed this market tiering extensively. For a decade, parents and students in New Orleans have only been offered mostly low-graded school options for their children. Only a select few students gain access to the top market tier through selective and burdensome application processes that many non-low performing schools require. Mercedes Schneider has written that most NOLA students of color, if they remain in school, and that's a big if, folks, because considering that the RSD is last and nearly last in all student outcomes, including dropout and graduation. So essentially, students are just being shuffled from low-graded charter school to another low-graded charter school. In conclusion, the predominance of the research and data should inform our discussion about school closure. And this is a point underscored by Jitu in his opening statement. The predominance of the research demonstrates that there is decreased student achievement, increased racial inequality, and parents of color still don't have access to properly resourced, high-quality neighborhood public schools. As a result, it seems clear the data suggests we consider alternatives to the top-down school closure approach for reforming schools. There is scant evidence in the research literature that supports top-down school closure policies. I believe this is largely because school closure has been, as Jitu Brown said in his opening, a shell game that does not directly address the needs of students or the communities that they live in. Therefore, it's incumbent upon us to think about community-based solutions that don't ignore the needs that students bring to schools and the severe resource inequalities that still plague schools in communities of color. It is my hope, and students should not have to choose between lunch and breakfast. It is my hope that the reauthorization of VSEA that will be signed today in just an hour or so will provide momentum for a slate of community-based, democratically controlled approaches to education reform. I look forward to hearing more about community schools as one of those community-based alternatives to turn back the recent decade of top-down reform. Thank you.